first off, can you talk me through the 700 claimants you worked with? What was the most common experience you found with them?
So we talked to 782 people. About 147 of those were advisors, and they were around the UK. And what we did with their testimony was kind of benchmark them against international standards of what social security systems are supposed to be according to the UN. And so the findings are, well, it's no surprise to anybody, given that the poverty levels are 16 million and 36% of children in the UK experiencing poverty, that the level isn't enough. The payment level is too small to meet the purpose, actually, of a social security system to ensure people can have an adequate standard of living, afford food and housing. But the large bulk of what the findings kind of indicate is that the system is too difficult to navigate for people. The assessment processes are quite brutal and often don't turn out the result of people getting access to the benefits that they're eligible for, meaning people have to go through long, kind of lengthy appeals processes to get what they're entitled to. And 7 out of 10 PIP claims that go to appeal are overturned. So people do get granted it, but it takes up to 18 months. And one of the biggest things that I think came out for me that I was not surprised about, but the wealth of feeling about this was overwhelming, really, that people just don't feel like they're being treated with dignity and respect. You know, there's a real issue in the social security system that people feel like they're being treated cruelly, whether that's because they're getting 100% sanction, you know, their basic universal credit just being stopped because they've missed a bus, or and the lack of compassion in the interactions with DWP. So we had one lady who talked about losing her child and then being told she had to make her appointment or she would be sanctioned. You know, the system is broken in our view. It's not human rights compliant. It is violating human rights, and we think that there is no time now to do tinkering around the edges. In order to bring it back on track to being human rights compliant would need a whole scale reform. So we're calling for a social security commission that has statutory powers that can reform the system overall, with some quick fixes for those urgent and emergency, actually, I think, preventions of harm that are needed, like ending sanctions and lifting two-child limit.
I mean, looking through the report, it does mention that our social security system, as I mean, you've already pointed out, fails basic human rights. I was going to ask you what particular part of our benefit system was the most egregious, but it seems like the communication, the back and forth, and the sort of general feeling people have, which is that they are treated as not human, essentially.
Yeah, in fact, worse than that, they're demonized, you know, in the media as well, and in the political discourse. You know, the idea that people are, you know, fraudulently claiming or somehow kind of, you know, choosing a life on benefits is just a total fallacy. Like, when people talk to us and we ask them specifically, what do you want to change? And they talk about needing more money. Of course they do. But what they really want is to be treated like humans, to be believed, to have their experiences when they're relating their health problems, not to have those misrepresented in the documents that come back to them, and to get the thing that they're entitled to, but not to feel shame as a result of it. And fear is at the heart of the system. Like, imagine worrying that if you miss a phone call. Like, one lady said to me that she went to the toilet and missed a phone call, and she's just so frightened to go again to the toilet when there might be a phone call coming. You know, that kind of precarity, that fear that you're living with literally every day, that you might say the wrong thing or make a mistake and lose all of your income, is a horrific state of affairs. And that's because of the sanctions regime. It's because it's been designed into the system, this kind of power imbalance. For people who are already facing real challenges in their lives. That's why they're claiming in the first place.
I mean, of course, issues with our welfare system has been from successive governments. That's laid out. But can you tell me what the impact has been from Labour's policies, especially the cutting of personal independent payment?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Various different governments have played sort of political football with the social security system, and that's exacerbated poverty. It's made it worse. It's exacerbated mental health problems. Actually, loads of people told us 78% of people who were sanctioned said that it had a negative impact on their mental health, and people are, sharing kind of suicidal ideation and stuff as part of the research as well. It's awful. The hope that this Labour government was going to come in and reform the welfare system to be more human rights compliant, I think, has gone now. We're in a situation where the cuts that they put forward in the Green Paper and the Spring Statement are retrogressive. There's no two ways about it. They do not tackle poverty. They, in fact, through their own impact assessment, which many people believe is an underestimation, they do say that 250,000 more people will be in poverty. That's a retrogressive measure. They are removing some of the legal protections for uprating methodology. So basically, the Secretary of State can set benefit levels. What's supposed to happen under the international frameworks is that minimum level should be protected, cast iron, as a methodology and a measure of a minimum standard of living. So some charities talk about it as an essential guarantee. It's like a protection floor that no one should fall below. And we don't have that in the UK. What we have is bits of legislation that say how the government should make decisions on welfare. And in order to implement the cuts, in the social security benefits, they're going to have to unpick some of those legal protections that mean that they have to be uprated annually. So actually what we're doing is taking a massive backward step when what we should be doing is actually doing the opposite, legally protecting these rights, legally protecting a social minimum floor no one can fall below in their standard of living, so that you can't have political whim just ripping people's rights away, making their poverty worse.
That's interesting you said that we're taking a step back. I mean, from all the rhetoric from the Labour Party, it was, we are going to make a more humane system. And often it's framed around getting people back into work. Now, obviously, for years, we've known that millions of people are in work or also claiming benefits. Wages aren't high. So I think as a misnomer when the Labour Party or any government says we need to get people into work. But also, I do want to ask, because obviously you spoke to many people who's trapped in the system. Do they feel like anything has changed in the last 9 months for better or for worse?
So to take the first part of the question, many people who claim benefits are in work. 37%, I think, of universal credit claimants. Certainly people claim personal independence payments in order to stay in work. And I think we have to recognise that. But by setting a kind of arbitrary change to the eligibility criteria based on points system doesn't necessarily mean that those people can get into work. And what's terrifying is that we're going to apply sanctions to those people who have never been able to work, but they now no longer are eligible for PIP, or even if they are eligible for support, they're still talking about putting those sanctions on. We're in the process of deteriorating mental health here. Interesting though, to come back to that dignity and respect point, if you talk to claimants in Scotland about their experiences of the system, the part that's partially devolved, so the adult disability payments, claimants of that say it's still not enough, but at least they treat us with compassion. So there is a real significant difference in their experience of how they're interacting with government officials through their claims. So there isn't a specific kind of deterioration or improvement since Labour came into office, but there are significant improvements. It shows that you don't necessarily have to spend money to change culture. And that's what's at the heart of the indignity, right? Where's the accountability for that? It's not built into the system. How can people get access to justice for that? Well, they can't. There's no legally protected rights.
No, I think that's a really good point, because I do think we should uplift benefits. It should be more. But I think you're right that many people in the system, I've been in the system, right? And I can tell you that, I echo a lot of the sentiments that the people you spoke to. It's incredibly difficult. The communication is abysmal. One example is, I tried getting a phone call with one of them, and you have to log into your journal and then they'll call you back. You can't just ring up and speak to someone. It's incredibly difficult, and it feels like it's almost, the system is set up in a way that they don't want you to claim in the first place.
I mean, people do say that. So they talk about it being designed to sort of push people away. And that might be because of the digital divide. And lots of people talk to us about that. Lots of people who have accessible information needs shared experiences of those not being met, and almost being kind of punished because they were unable to communicate in the ordinary ways. In the NHS, there's the accessible information standard where they're held to account for um, you know, providing information that's in formats that people can understand. That doesn't exist. So we had one claimant who is deaf who couldn't take part in a telephone assessment and therefore didn't get access to what he was eligible for. We've had people saying that they need to sit down in the job centre and they're told they're not allowed to, or people who, because of their health needs, need the toilet and they're told they're not allowed to. There are ways that the system sort of pushes people away. It makes people feel like they're not welcome. It makes people talk about feeling like they're begging for help. This isn't a charitable act. This is a human right, and it's a political choice to provide a kind of lesser offer to people and to make that worse. And the government don't need to choose that. There are alternative options for them. That's why we think there needs to be this whole-scale statutory commission that just reforms everything. Quick fixes on two-child limit, other things like that, but this whole-scale reform is needed. It's veered too far off the path of what its main purpose is, towards coercion into employment rather than protection from deprivation.
You mentioned the two-child benefit cap. What other things do you think we can do to immediately change this? And then I suppose another question is the wider implications, the wider policies, whether it's looking at the media, because the way people are stigmatized in the media, whether it's looking at the economy as a whole, maybe a universal basic income, that everyone has sort of a basic level of living. Is that something that maybe you would hope to see from this report?
Yeah, so I mean, we have a long list, um, but the quick fixes, these are things that need to happen now to stop the harms that are happening within the system. So lifting the two-child limit for sure. There's an opportunity to do that through the child poverty strategy. Is it looking likely they're going to do that? I'm not sure, and that includes the benefit cap overall as well, and including the local housing allowance and re-indexing that to the real cost of rent. We also think that the 5-week wait loan that is given while someone's waiting to claim universal credit, but then gets immediately deducted from their first payments and their payments every month until it's paid off, that could just be given as a grant, because what you're immediately doing is taking a level of social security benefit that's already too little and making it even lower immediately on day one. Um, and absolutely, sanctions don't work as an incentive to work. Even the DWP's own evidence suggests that. Stop them and don't make further measures like those that have been proposed in the Green Paper that make things worse. That needs to stop. They need to rethink that before they go too far down that road. But the answer to this is in legal protections and in wholesale reform. Like a Beveridge report, Labour Party politicians have mentioned that in the lead up to the general election, Beveridge's 5 giants. It feels like a moment where we need to review what we've got and reform it to make it fit for purpose today. So that's the Social Security Commission. They had one in Beveridge's day. Let's do that again and reform. That's going to take a long time. I get that. But we can't tinker around the edges anymore. Even politicians are saying that it's a broken system. Let's fix it properly, not patch it up. And that means looking at the legislation that underpins the social security system to make sure that the rate of benefits is attached to the real cost of the essentials, not based on CPI and all of these other things until you get the starting level right. And we haven't got that. And until we protect that so that you don't get someone coming in with a political ideology that's very different and just removing them completely. And that they are vulnerable. People feel vulnerable. People feel targeted. We need to stop that. You talked earlier about the kind of where the stigma is coming from. Right. And this is long ingrained into our system, the deserving and the undeserving poor. We've talked about this a lot. I think part of the problem as it stands now, in the language that we're using, even from a Labour Party point of view, talking about being the party of working people, it sort of implies that anybody who is unable to work is not represented by the current government. I think there needs to be a real kind of process through which politicians of all political colours look at the way that they're talking about people who are vulnerable, already marginalised, to make sure that they're not targeting them. Because what politicians put out there into the public is reflected back in the public values. And I get that that's a cycle. I get what the public think will influence policy, but we're in a position where people are really like struggling. We've had people talking about getting heckled outside of job centres. This is not okay, and we need to make sure that we're responsible in the language that we're using, so that we don't put people off from claiming what they're entitled to, or make them feel ashamed that they do.
I mean, I like what you're saying. It sounds like you and the report are calling for a really radical change here, a real overhaul of the system, not tinkering around the edges. So I like hearing that. Jen, I want to thank you so much for coming on. I want to thank you for the important work you're doing. It's very much needed. So I really appreciate that.